I'm very glad to be able to talk with my longtime friend Harold McGee, who is very kind to have come out here. And we might have a really exciting session because at any moment the power may go out. Nonetheless, because this is an intimate room designed to be a recital hall, we will simply carry on in the dark or in the semi-light. So we can hope for that. And we'll simply return to a lot of historical origins of cooking, which our guest has explicated for us over many years. So, one of the reasons on Food and Cooking, which was first published in 1984, and this is the completely revised 2/3 of the text you rewrote. Most revisions are incredibly cosmetic with a nice new cover and a prayer for more sales. This, in fact, was a complete revision, and part of the reason it needed to be revised was because Harold created a genre, in the words of Charles Mann, who is here today. How many authors can say they created a genre? Therefore, between 1984, when the book came out, and 2004, the idea of understanding the scientific procedures behind food was a commonplace in any professional cook's kitchen, really in any home cook's kitchen. Those of us who are obsessed with baking, that's one of the reasons I came so early to your book, was because you know you have to understand chemistry and the tiniest bit of physics to bake properly. But there's so much more. And so, Harold, are you on Hal terms with the public, or no?
Whichever.
No. Harold. We'll stick with Harold. So Harold decided, I have to make this reflect modern times. So you axed the chapters on nutrition, which I'm sorry to see go, and taste and smell. Well, you were leaving that for your next book.
Digestion. No, I had no idea they were coming later.
Maybe it was a premonition, because that is Harold's next book, which we'll ask you about toward the end. But there's so much more, and he had to go into more detail because cooks demanded it. It has become a must in every cook's kitchen and in every cooking school's curriculum, which, as you may know if you have ever toiled writing a book, you hope against hope that your book will be assigned by teachers. That is the best thing that can ever happen to an author, and it has happened to On Food and Cooking, which is one reason it's still in hardcover only, another holy grail for authors, because it's so much more durable and the royalties are so much higher for a book in hardcover. And I was just reading this very purloined copy. Why did I have to steal this copy? It has sold out. And so everyone understands the value and the power of this writing. So I took very good care of it. If the owner is in this room, it really is pristine. And I want to read a bit from it, but I'll start by saying, why did you go from science at Caltech to English, and then how'd you get back to science?
I went from science to English because I was at Caltech, and I thought I was going to be an astronomer, and I had friends who could take a look at homework that would take me 2 or 3 days to finish. They would look at it, write the answer down, and then go have fun. Watch a movie in Hollywood. So I decided physics is for them and not for me. I'll find something else. And I'd always been interested in literature. So I thought I would transfer, but then the professors at Caltech in literature and history said, stay here, because Caltech actually offers a Bachelor of Science degree in literature. And you can continue to cherry pick whatever science you want, and we'll give you tutorials because we don't have any students. So
we're desperate for you to stay.
Yeah. So it was a great 3 or 4 years. I then went to graduate school, got a PhD, and then couldn't find a job.
The PhD was?
In literature.
So you continued with literature. And what was your area of literature?
I wrote a dissertation on John Keats.
So this kind of compactness and power of language really tells on every page of this book, which is why I was setting you up for this. For example, he just uses unusual and absolutely precise words. So he mixes the eloquence of a real writer and poet with the precision of a scientist. And that's one of the reasons this book has maintained its complete utility and the reason that we all need to see it. It also sends people like me into the kitchen. For example, I, who spent years writing a book on coffee and then revising it, The Joy of Coffee, there's my little plug, my very subtle plug, did not know this about milk foams. So all of you like cappuccinos and espresso foam and steaming it in the wand. How many of you have steamers or have tried to steam milk? See how it's taken over? Of course, that was because you all have my book, The Joy of Coffee, which had strict instructions on how to do this. Well, Harold's book not only gives those instructions, it gives the reason why. You need to start with very cold milk. You need to have over 2/3 of a cup of milk in order for it to stay cold enough while the foam is forming, and you need to keep the nozzle, which is a complete iron rule among every barista, directly at the top of the milk. So the steam is just submerged in the milk, and it's incredibly delicate, the act of keeping it right at the milk. And people spend forever. But there are easy ways around it, and this is one I did not know. So to foam a small volume of milk without steam, separate the foaming and heating steps. Pour cold, fresh milk into a jar, tighten the lid, and shake it vigorously for 20 seconds or until the contents have doubled in volume. Anyone who's made whipped cream this way knows that it works. It starts to increase in volume. Or froth in a plunger coffee maker whose fine screen produces an especially thick foamy milk. So if you have a French press with a nylon screen, the cheaper, less romantic La Coupole way, but probably better, it will, the resistance, the pressure, right? The resistance explain this. How is it that the resistance creates this foam as you pour the extremely fine mesh screen down as you push it down?
Well, the resistance is a manifestation of the smallness of the apertures. You're trying to force a lot into these small apertures, and you end up entraining air in the process.
Entraining. How many of you would have used the word entraining? And so once it's made, this is the part I had no idea of. Stabilize the foam, remove the lid, place the jar in the microwave, and heat on high for about 30 seconds. Or until the foam rises to the top of the jar. I've seen many of these little immersion prop propeller blenders and thought, but it doesn't last worth a damn, so why would I ever do it? So now I can put it in the microwave. So how do you come up with these tricks and tips, of which there are many, studied throughout the book? And do you want to tell us about an experiment you indulged in this very morning?
Leading questions. I come up with them simply because I'm trying to understand how something works, and I play around. That's really what it amounts to. And I got into this habit when I wrote the first edition of this book, not knowing anything about food or cooking. I was learning as I wrote, and realized that the food science literature that I was depending on for information didn't answer a lot of questions that home cooks and restaurant cooks are interested in. So I would learn what I could from the food scientists and then try to see whether that applied in my home kitchen. And it turned out that lots of times it didn't. And so I ended up doing a book after the first of this one called The Curious Cook, which is all experiments, because there were so many experiments that occurred to me. This milk foaming thing was...
It's wonderfully written, The Curious Cook, and it has a black cover. Is it still in print?
No.
Just go out and find it. It's full of really lovely essays that take you step by step through the experiments if you were as smart as Harold. But you don't have to be, because he makes it so wonderfully accessible. I really love that book.
Well, and it just seems to me, my physics was long ago. What I think I'm doing is just taking essentially common sense and trying things out. And if it works, it works, and if it doesn't, it doesn't. It's not that different. Julia Child, in one of the books published after her death, there's a passage in which she describes her efforts to understand mayonnaise when she was working on French cooking. And she said that she insisted, after listening to chef after chef, opine and pontificate about the only way that you can make a mayonnaise, all of which were mutually exclusive, she decided she was going to figure it out for herself. And she said she probably made more mayonnaise in the course of a few days than most people have made in their lifetimes, that she dumped most of it down the toilet. But she had to make what she called an operational proof that a technique actually was a viable one. So theory, talking about molecules, whatever, doesn't matter if it doesn't work. And that was important to her, and that's what I try to keep to myself. If there's lots to food, they're really complicated materials, but not all those complications are important when it comes down to cooking.
Or need you and train us and them. What about the trick to saving a failed mayonnaise, which happens to us all, as in we should not be making it in this weather, right? You should not be making it during a thunderstorm.
Right, yeah. Don't make it in this weather. Never reverse the direction of your whisk. I mean, all kinds of crazy rules about making mayonnaise. You can make mayonnaise and don't try to emulsify more than half a cup of oil in one egg yolk, or it's going to be a disaster.
But is that true or not?
No, it's not. So in The Curious Cook, I took that as a challenge, not as fact. And so I took an egg yolk and I just started adding oil to see how far I could get. And I ended up adding quarts. It didn't taste very good, but you don't have to worry about the amount of oil.
And if it's constantly separating, what is the trick?
You just start over again. So a mayonnaise is an emulsion of little oil droplets in a water base. The egg yolk is, even though it seems very fatty and creamy, it's actually water with lots of oil droplets in it. So you just, if it's broken, you start with just some plain water, and then slowly beat the broken mayonnaise into the water, and it reforms itself.
Got that? Water can save when you run out of eggs and you're running out of oil, water. That is a life-saving tip, and the book is full of many of them. Now, today's experiment, how did you happen upon something that made you think, I want to try this for myself?
Well, I'm here at Kent Presents for the first time, and
not the last.
Fine with me. And it seemed to me, there were all these urgent questions being addressed in so many of the sessions, and I was looking for something that we could talk about that would be as urgent, as important. And so I actually found something this week that really does count as breaking news. And the breaking news has to do with the breaking of spaghetti.
It really does mean breaking.
So, has anyone heard about the Richard Feynman observation about spaghetti breaking? So it's, yeah.
2 hands have gone up. That's the magic of Kent Presents.
Yes. So Feynman, it's reported by one of his students in the 90s. He and his student were making dinner together, and they started. One or the other of them made the observation that when you're, breaking pasta to fit in a pot that's not quite wide enough, that it never breaks just in 2 pieces. It always breaks into more than 2 pieces. So I'll demonstrate, aiming at him so that I don't injure anyone else.
Thanks.
But
Okay.
so that was what, 2 or 3
No, it was
pieces?
4.
4.
It was 4.
Okay.
Thank you.
So the question was why, And he and the student, were drinking red wine and trying to come up with theories. And according to the student, years and years after the fact, they didn't come up with something that satisfied either one of them. But there's no record of what they actually talked about. But Feynman's interest in this question then became kind of legendary. And so it became known as the Feynman spaghetti problem. And a paper was published about it by a couple of French physicists a few years ago. They were awarded the Ig Nobel Prize for their
Do any of you
efforts.
follow the Ig Nobel? I know that we have several people who follow the Ig Nobel, IGNOBEL. It comes out when, in the early summer? It's just hilarious. It's about failed experiments or ridiculous experiments, but it actually is very instructive to read about them.
Yeah, and some of them are really good experiments, but on odd things like this.
Yeah, they're really funny.
Anyway, so this last week, a paper was published in the Proceedings of the National Academies of Science on exactly this question, trying to understand in more detail what's going on when you snap a piece of spaghetti. And the claim of the paper was that if you twist the rod before you snap it, that the twist will redistribute the stress that you're putting on the length in between, and the result is that you can reliably get just two pieces. So I just spent about half an hour under one of the maple trees outside trying to replicate this, and I think it's clear that the paper does say that they exerted strong pressure to get the twist that they needed to make this happen, so I couldn't get it to work. But I did, in the course of doing this, find out a couple of interesting things. One is that you can reliably get it to break into two if you just do it really slowly. Oop, that was three.
Nobody saw this.
Slowly enough. And that the faster you break it, the more pieces you get. So let me see if I can. So interesting stuff, spaghetti. Not a practical solution, but interesting. And that's the kind of thing I like to do.
By the end of this, Robert Lang, I'm going to be asking how origami folds and stresses on folds and between folds can bear on this. So that's the kind of thing that you would not put into an article or a revise because it doesn't result in something practical.
I might write an article about it. I wrote an article about how difficult it is to reliably get the shell off of a hard-boiled egg.
Another Julia Child conundrum. She in the French Chef's Kitchen, which is, I think, my favorite of her book, she has an endless chapter on hard-boiled eggs and getting the shell out. But what's your technique?
Well, after working at it for many, many weeks, I decided the only way to do it is to etch the shell away with citric acid.
Etch.
Etch.
That sounds a little dangerous and inedible.
It's really fun.
Okay, so how does one do this?
You just, citric acid is sour salt. Mm-hmm. It's something that you can find.
Borscht, Jews, borscht. It's a Russian Jewish, and in fact Russian thing. You always have to have citric salt with your beet soup. It's one of the three acids, lemon and vinegar being the others. So
you just get citric acid, you boil your eggs, and then you dunk them in a bath of citric acid, and it bubbles like crazy and spins, and it's a lot of fun to watch, actually.
But how does it affect the flavor?
Not at all, because you're just getting the shell off, and then you.
But what happens is the shell? Does it disintegrate?
Yeah, it dissolves into the acid.
No. Really?
Really.
But, so there's nothing left, for example, the trick of when you have hard-boiled shells, if you're making a soup stock at the same time, the wonderful French trick is you take the broken shells and you put them at the top of the stock in order that to coagulate with the scum. So you can then skim off the scum easily. So you don't have any shell pieces left?
No. It's all gone.
Wow. It doesn't have any scum, as Peter points out. Okay, so this sets me up for the only other passage. Every book is full of passages. I just want to read to you. But since I make scrambled eggs a lot, and half the time they come out exactly as I wish they would not, here are Harold's instructions about scrambled eggs. First, cream, butter, milk, water, or oil, which is used in China, will dilute the egg proteins and produce a tenderer mass when the eggs are carefully cooked. Overheating, however, will cause some of the added liquid to separate, so watch how much you put in. Watery vegetables like mushrooms, as everyone knows, need to be pre-cooked and then drained in order to prevent them from weeping into the eggs, another good word. Chopped eggs, vegetables, or meat should be warm, not hot or cold, to avoid uneven heating or adjacent egg protein. So here's the paragraph. The key to scrambled eggs is slow cooking. Scrambled eggs made in the usual quick, offhand way are usually hard and forgettable. The key to moist scrambled eggs is low heat and patience. They'll take several minutes to cook. The eggs should be added to the pan just as butter begins to bubble, or oil makes a water drop dance gently. Textures are determined by how and when the eggs are disturbed. Disturbed. These are such great words. Large irregular curds result if the cook lets the bottom layer set for some time before scraping to distribute the heat. Constant scraping and stirring prevents the egg proteins at the bottom from setting into a separate firm layer, which you would want in an omelet, but you don't want in scrambled eggs, and produces a creamy, even mass of yolk and thin white punctuated with very fine curds of thick white. Scrambled eggs should be removed from the pan while still slightly underdone. I want my spouse to be paying close attention, who likes only completely done eggs, since they will continue to thicken for some time with their residual heat. Did this change the way you make scrambled eggs?
No, I would say that's the outcome of my cooking scrambled eggs. I mean, I made them very badly for a long time and then tried to figure out why they were not so good and how I might make them better.
So in one paragraph, you have your life's work in front of you. I'm about to open this for questions, but it reminds me, reading this, of the vogue for immersion cookers and sous vide under vacuum, and how many poached eggs now in professional kitchens in restaurants have been cooked in a vacuum in a very, very, very slow water bath for hours to a certain temperature. And you can't tell because, in fact, they look terribly runny, but they're safe. They're 170 degrees, so the egg yolks are safe to eat. But what do you think of molecular gastronomy, which was a word used to describe this panel, and all of the vogue for these techniques like sous vide and evaporators and centrifuges?
Yeah. I think it's been a wonderful development with limited utility. Mm-hmm. So I think it's an expression of the fact that people, in fact, what I don't understand is why it took cooks and scientists both to realize how interesting these materials are and these preparations are, and why this all didn't happen much earlier than it did. I'm glad that it didn't, because then I wouldn't have been able to participate.
Have a runaway bestseller.
Right. But to me, they just represent really smart and curious people trying things out to see what difference they make and seeing what they can do with those new machines and those new ingredients. And then what works, what's delicious, what's interesting to a lot of people sticks around, and the rest kind of goes away. And in the case of sous vide, it's I think most useful for restaurants, mm-hmm. given what they need to do logistically. Not so useful for home cooks.
But for a while, it was absolutely de rigueur to order a sous vide machine at home. Did any of you order a sous vide machine? I see you're pointing to somebody, like, make sure you raise your hand. You did. And how many of you who bought them continue to use them to this day after a few experiments? Okay, so we've got some true believers here. What do you think, and Harold had much more than his fair share of molecular gastronomy, because every experimenting chef dreamt of having him come through the doors. So what are some of the happy eating experiences you had and would happily repeat?
You should have given me warning about
I didn't
this
prep him. That's unfair. Is it something you want to see continue in the realm of experimentation? And can you think of any semi-transcendent eating experiences that resulted?
That resulted from that kind of cooking, I would say no. I mean, the moments that I really remember from my dining life, which is not nearly as extensive as yours.
I'm sure that's not true.
Really have more to do with the whole package. You know, it's the place and the people and the wine and everything. And often these more experimental restaurants are a little bit austere and not so warm and friendly, and so I think that has something to do with it.
Do you see how judicious and tactful he is? But if I challenged you and said, and please, can we have the mic runners looking and hands up? If I challenged you and said, all of the results that are good and are claimed for these new techniques could be mimicked by a conventional cook with the understanding of the underlying principles, I don't even know the answer. Is that true or not?
It's true of a lot of things, but I think not true for others. For example, I think it would be very difficult to duplicate what liquid nitrogen can do for ice cream any other way.
Dippin' Dots.
Yeah. But also just, you know, extremely fine-grained ice cream. It's not so easy.
Okay, good. So we have some true applications. Could we start with Christine right here in the beginning, and can you then give the mic to the gentleman in the third row? Then Peter.
So this is a rather prosaic question, but after telling your scrambled egg story, I wonder if there's any food that you thought you didn't like, that once you experimented or discovered some new form of preparation, you became, you know, a big fan of.
That's a really good question. Yeah, natto. Natto. Natto is fermented soybeans. It's not exactly a staple, but very popular in Japan. And I'd had it. It has the reputation. Well, it's weird stuff because you basically cook the soybeans and then incubate them with a particular bacterium. And overnight, it develops a very different kind of texture and flavor and color. It turns dark. Flavor becomes a little funky, although it always seems kind of like coffee to me. But then it develops these really, if you dip chopsticks in and lift, you end up with these strings of goop that go up, and that's a big part of the experience. So, you know, you get a little scoop of natto on some rice and you stir it together and you end up with this froth of goopy stuff and fermented soybeans. The only examples I'd had of that until I started to do it myself were imported and frozen and thawed and who knows how many weeks old it was. But when I made it myself, I thought it was really delicious, really interesting. My family didn't agree, but...
But that's what families are for. Charlton.
One of the many pleasures of your book is that you explode a lot of myths, and you say this is wrong and so forth. I'm curious if you got pushback on any of that.
Not on any particular points that I remember. I mean, I did get pushback from back in the day from chefs who said, and I'm thinking in particular of this wonderful fellow from Chicago who had a Hungarian place. Do you remember his name?
Oh,
sort of a national figure.
No, sorry, two in front of you. He something like George Lang, but it wasn't George Lang. And his daughter has a food history collection in Providence, Rhode Island. Sathmari, Louis Sathmari.
Yes, that's it. That's it. So I met him in. Met him in 1985, 86, something like that. And he made a point of coming up to me and saying, your book is very interesting for sort of the amateur, but it has nothing to do with what we in professional kitchens do. We have a completely different way of doing things, completely different agenda. So, good luck, basically. And I've gotten the same initially. In fact, I was telling you that when I met my partner's sister in Japan, she had exactly the same reaction. This is now 2 years ago. I explained what I do, and her response was to say, well, who would want to know about that? I mean, cooks already know how to cook, so, what use is that?
It was the rare, extremely blunt Japanese woman. Peter. Peter. Peter.
This is more an industrial question, but there's a huge movement towards local foods overall, starting with the kitchen. Everyone feels that they can open a restaurant because they like to eat. Similarly, people think they can start companies, but food safety is a big issue. Mm-hmm. What can you do, or what do you suggest to be looked at as ways of preserving food and protecting it against disease, various forms of contaminants for the local chef or the local cook without putting gums, stabilizers, things like that?
Uh-huh. Actually, that's a great question, and the cooks have actually begun to discover that for themselves, and that's to go back to fermentation, which was the original way to preserve foods and make them safe and keep them safe. So, house-made pickles and all sorts of things like that, charcuterie, are all ways of taking local ingredients in season, and then you cook them fresh as much as you can, and then the rest of it you pickle or preserve or cure or whatever you're going to do, and then serve it in the winter.
And do you make shrub out of your fruit?
I don't, but I applaud those who do.
Very good.
Well, thank you for this wonderful speech and commentary about food. Tell me about the salt, everything, your wonders of salt, spices, and do you have, when you're talking about frying, because I'm looking at other things that you've done, do you have a recommendation on what type of frying pan? Iron skillet or?
Well, when it comes to skillets, the different materials just have different behaviors, and so it kind of depends on what you're looking for. If it's convenience, then you get a non-stick aluminum pan. If you want to do some kind of heavy-duty browning and broiling and things like that, then you get cast iron. There's nothing that beats that. And then other materials, serve other purposes. And then
salt, wonders of salt, and then the spices, wonders of spices.
I'm not quite sure what your question is about.
Can you give some information or some details when you say wonders of salt? That was one thing on a YouTube that you shared, wonders of salt.
Oh,
Wonders
well,
of
did you
Salt.
even title it that? And do you have any idea what the talk was about?
I don't.
Salt is a preservative. It will help with Peter's fermentation. Spices also will help with fermentation. Well, then
Well-
you'll have to look at his
Just
YouTube.
very
and-
quickly, I can say that it probably came out of a piece I wrote for the New York Times about salts in general and the hype surrounding artisanal salts of various kinds. That is to say, they have flavors, very special, specific flavors, if essentially that's all you're tasting, but the moment it goes into a food, all that delicate complexity goes away.
And spices?
There are so many and so many different things, I'm sorry.
No, stop. Sorry. Okay.
baking in a healthier way. Obviously, there are different ways, different substitutes for white flour. And even with a key lime pie, you could use chia seeds. But using butter and sugar, let's say cups of white sugar, what can one substitute instead of using lots of white sugar, which the Times seems to always call for?
This is in sort of desserts.
Desserts.
Desserts, okay.
No, well, the crusts are really as a basis for so many baked goods.
Well, I mean, it depends on what you're making. So if it's a savory baked good and the recipe calls for sugar, then I would just omit it. And then when it comes to sweet crusts, usually you can throttle it back significantly without really noticing a difference. You know, usually when you're enjoying a baked dessert, the crust is there as support and textural contrast, but you're mainly tasting the filling. And so I think you're not going to miss salt in the crust itself.
Sugar.
Sorry, sugar, yeah. But you're gonna, if you take a lot out, then you're gonna have to compensate for that in other ways. And it, again, depends on what's important to you. Should the crust be very short and brittle, or do you want it to be more flaky? And, you know, so making adjustments is the challenge.
Two books will come. I'm terribly sorry that we are out of time. I would like much more time. Two books that I could recommend. One that I saw that you recommended, Shirley Corrier's Cookwise.
Yes.
A wonderful book which is extremely pragmatic. She comes at it from much more of the experience of a long-time cooking teacher who loves science. And Joanne Chang's new Low Sugar Baking. She's a wonderful baker, and it will answer many of your questions. But no book is as wonderful as Harold McGee's on food and cooking. And so thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you, Corby.